Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is or was the LK Chen Dragon Sparrow Dao, and it is a hidden hilt Dao in that the hilt kind of goes in and hides in this little pocket here, and it's really cool, and I got it from LK Chen, or rather they sent it to me some time ago, and I've had this for a long time, and it's taken me quite a while to get the review done, so I apologize for the wait, but hopefully it's been worth it. I do want to note a couple things before I get into the review. First and foremost, I got this sword for free from LK Chen, so if you think that makes me biased or invalidates the opinions and whatnot that you're going to see in this video, now you know ahead of time. Two, it's an older piece, so they've made some improvements and things like that since I got the sword. I was pretty late to the game in terms of reviewing it, so some of the problems and gripes that you'll see in this one may have been addressed in some of the newer versions of the sword that have come out since. And the other bit to note is that I don't study Chinese swordsmanship, so I don't know how to correctly move this sword. I understand it's a sword and it's sharp and it's pointy and you do sword-like things with it, but it is a little odd. It's got a hidden hilt, it draws a little differently, the grip is a little different, there's a few different ways to hold it, so it's more nuanced than perhaps some of the other swords are. That's what makes it cool, but it also makes it, well, you're going to see how awkward it is for me to handle, and I don't want you to get the impression that it's in any way a bad sword. The last bit I'll note is that on that point, there are two other YouTubers that have made very good videos that provide some context that you're not going to see in this video. One is Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. He covers history and some other bits about the sword that I'm not going to talk about, and so I would encourage you to watch his video. I will link it in the description down below, along with Phil Martin at Akitika's channel. He does some cutting with this sword that shows its capability in much more skilled hands, and more importantly, on more appropriate targets. I kind of go from water bottles, pool noodles later in the video to really abusive stuff, and I skip the middle ground. Phil Martin covers that for you and shows you what it's capable of doing if you have skill at cutting, which you're going to see in this video. I really don't. But the point is that either of those two videos are going to provide you with some additional information. I've linked them below. Anyway, getting on to the review. Right now, this sword is available at a couple places. It's LK Chen's website and Cult of Athena. They're at different prices, I'm guessing because of dealer markup or maybe because of shipping. In either case, I will link those as well in the description down below. But ballpark right now, I'm going to use Cult of Athena's price because that's what you can buy it at. Right now, it's $350 ballpark. So that's the kind of mindset I'm going to keep as I think of, is this sword worth the asking price or not? And I'll tell you right out of the gate, I think so, because it's odd and there's not a lot like it, right? There's just not a ton of stuff like it, and I think this sword offers some cool aspects from the standpoint of customizability and some other tinkering that you can do. And while it has faults, and I'll disclose those and talk about them in just a moment, I do think that it's a really compelling, cool sword, and there's just, I don't see other things like it. There's cane swords, there's other things that are maybe close, but just not quite the same as this sword. And so I do think it is somewhat unique in terms of what I've seen out there, and it comes with a little bit of a higher price than I might like to see, but at the same time, I think it offers something pretty cool. And hopefully I can can explain why I think that in the next however long-winded session this video will be. So starting with the pommel, the ring pommel at the end of this thing. Now this is, I believe, a bronze cast ring pommel, and you will be happy to know that it is a little bit more durable than the one on the Double Dragon Sway Dao that I tested some time ago. So I'm starting at the end, and I will show you how the pommel came off and is in my hand now. But suffice to say, it did last quite a bit longer and took some more abuse than the Double Dragon Sway Dao did. I was a little concerned with testing the other kind of a more elaborate ring pommel some time ago because it came off somewhat easily. This one did not, so worth knowing that right out of the gate. In terms of detail, I mean, the thing about this sword is that it's supposed to be either a one-for-one recreation or at least a very close in spirit recreation of a sword in particular. It's a replica of a historical artifact as opposed to an interpretation of one or something kind of close. Now I don't know if this pommel is on the original they're trying to replicate or not, but it's certainly similar, and the fittings and all of that are very, very similar to what you would see. So in terms of recreating the original, I think they did a pretty close job. It looks a little different to me, but overall I think it's a very close interpretation. I don't know if one for one would be the right word, but certainly preserving the spirit and aesthetic of what it looked like on the historic piece. There's only, I suppose, so much you can do with the casting quality. And while I might think that, hey, should some of these lines and things like that, should I be able to make out the scales a little bit more? That would make it sharp and hurt my hand, and this did not. It's detailed enough to show kind of what it's supposed to be, or at least some detail in here, but not so precise that it hurts your hand if you touch it. So some of those ledges can be kind of sharp. I never had a problem getting my fingers stuck or anything like that in the pommel either. I know you're not necessarily supposed to, but I tend to grip the pommel, and how you draw this in one particular way, this thing may end up in the meat of your hand a little more than you might expect, and it actually was not an uncomfortable experience. None of it bit me, and I appreciated that, and it was also pretty durable. You can see now that this one is somewhat bent because I threw it around, and it took quite a bit of punishment, but I'll talk about that later. Suffice to say, though, I think that the pommel is pretty. The cast bronze versus the brass, I understand that they're trying to replicate kind of historic materials and things like that. Personally, I'd like it to kind of match, I guess, have it all made of brass or all made of bronze, but that is, I guess, maybe wishful thinking. Again, they're trying to recreate something and preserve the original artifact. So I believe the original artifact had a bronze pommel, and that's why this is bronze, and the rest of the fittings are brass because there was a brass alloy or something similar used on the original. Anyway, there's the pommel. I don't know what this is actually supposed to be other than perhaps a sparrow or a dragon or both, but either way, it's an interesting looking pommel, and it held up well. You can see also construction-wise how this is fit on. The tang has a kind of a groove cut out of the back of it, out of the side of it, and then it has this tab, and this tab rests on top of the tang, and then there is a peg slotted through this, the wood and the tang of the actual sword itself. So it all holds together reasonably well. Okay, well, moving on to the grip, I can show you grip disassembly as well because I did pull the grip apart. It stayed together actually really well. Once the pommel came off, the little brass end was also easy to take off, but the grip actually held together really well. The little peg underneath it, along with the collar on top, made it a very durable thing in terms of usage. I found it easy to index. I found it small in my hand, but I really actually kind of liked the feel of the wooden grip. I didn't find it slippery, despite cutting bottles and getting my hand wet and things like that. So even though the wood looks relatively slick, it's not at all. I found it to be a very comfortable experience to use. The thing to note about the grip is really how you draw it, and so I can show some footage of me drawing it, but in a nutshell, you would have to hold it, and then perhaps on horseback you would draw it and the pommel would rest in your hand, though obviously you have enough grip to hold it higher, and so I imagine that a person might hold it differently depending on the context of their use. So if you're drawing from horseback and you're using it as I understand that these swords may have been, holding it by the pommel gives it a point of balance that's a little more forward heavy, a little more tip heavy, and it feels more like a cavalry saber would if you were, cutting down. It has that kind of tip forward heft to it that gives you a lot more authority in the cut. Alternatively, when you hold the grip higher up, it feels a little bit more nimble in your hand, and it feels like you have a little bit more point control. And obviously, the lack of guard means your hand could slide up. I don't know how much you're going to thrust, even though you certainly could. Nevertheless, you have a little bit more dexterity in fencing or something like that if that was your application, by holding the grip a little further up. Anyway, the grip worked well, and the interesting piece about it, obviously, is that it fits into the little pocket and holds together, and you only see the little pommel and the other brass bit sticking out. So that is one of the key features of this sword. It is worth noting that the grip and how it fits into the scabbard I had mixed results, and from what I understand, the fit and finish can vary depending on your climate and the one that you have. Mine was pretty tight. Consistently, it didn't loosen up a lot in the winter. It never fell out. It was always somewhat tight and always required somewhat of a little bit of a jerk to get out of the scabbard. Not a huge amount, not not something that I had to take it and really jar it apart. A quick motion, a quick jerk of my hips, a quick pull with my hand would dislodge the sword, and I could pull it and do that one-handed. But at the same time, it required some force. It never fell out. It was never loosey-goosey. From what I understand, that may have been the case with some, where you could tip it and it would come out a little bit more easily. That wasn't the case with mine, and maybe that's a good or a bad thing. I personally think it's good for maybe some of the customization options that I'll talk about later, or some cool thoughts that I had about this particular sword. But I'll save those for later. Just know that it was pretty tight in there. It's also worth knowing that supposedly this hidden hilt may have mitigated some water. I did not personally find that to be the case. All right, so supposedly these hidden tang things had some sort of water mitigation, and you can see that this looks reasonably tight, and it's pretty tight in there, so maybe it works. I thought what I'd do is spray this with water a little bit and see if the sword has any moisture on it. You can see right now I've just sharpened it and cleaned it up. It has no moisture on it of any kind, so I'm going to put the sword back in here, secure it nice and tight, and then ask my daughter to give me a hand with the hose. Faith, would you spray this with a hose for me?
Yeah, sure, but wouldn't it be more realistic if you held it closer to you, like near your waist?
Yeah, I guess it's like it's supposed to be drawn from like a cavalry or something like that, so I guess a cavalry person would just have it sprayed with water. They'd probably have it hanging about here. Let's see, my end frame? Yeah, okay. Try not to get me too wet.
Okay.
Nope, that's not the sword. That's not the sword. That's okay. Nope. Oh, that's cold. Oh, that's surprisingly cold. Okay, can you get a little, at least on the sword? Okay, well, that's not helpful. That's my feet. That's okay. I think I see what you did. Wow, that is very cold. Ooh. Okay. Nope. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not sure. We'll see if we got any on here. Well, no, it's pouring out, and there's water all the way down the blade. So I'm going to say that it has not the best water mitigation technique capability. It is wet. This was a very useful test. So obviously you can see water can get down there. It's not watertight, but obviously that was a representation of like a torrential downpour, light drizzle. Maybe it wouldn't have gotten in there, and it was certainly less water than if it was just sitting out or pouring in the scabbard by itself. But it doesn't make it watertight exactly, even though it fits pretty tight. Anyway, moving down onto the scabbard, this is a hefty scabbard. These brass pieces on here add a lot of weight, and I like up at the top right here we have the wood fit into the brass, and then wood that kind of comes around, and you can see that it is kind of fit over the top of the wood, as opposed to the other fittings which are just slid on. And so one of the fittings has come loose, and it came loose pretty quick. And earlier in the video I noted that this is an early sample, so maybe they've addressed this, and I know Chen is using a different adhesive now, and that the ones that I got early on used an adhesive that didn't particularly hold up well to the temperature changes, and it's been an issue with a few of the swords that I had. It's not a big problem. I mean, I can just slide it up, but it does leave little scuffs and things like that as I move it around, and it just needs more or different adhesive. As it is, it kind of has a natural friction point up here, and then it holds reasonably steady. But I would have liked to see like it fit into the wood as opposed to just riding along the top. The same thing with this little chape area down here, where it's just kind of glued over the top. Now this has not come loose at all. It's very sturdy on there, but I would have liked to see the wood kind of butt up to it as opposed to just being glued on top. Now as it is, this is a very sturdy scabbard, so much so that I think it could be functional as its own weapon. It feels very, very solid. It doesn't have a lot of bend or give to it, and the wood quality seems nice. I like the coloration, and the wood held up well. It's been bounced around quite a bit since I've had it, but overall I would say it's a handsome scabbard and has a lot of heft to it with these brass fittings on. It's also handsome, and I like the way it looks with the sword, or at least when I could, with the sword just placed in. I thought it was a handsome looking sword all in all. And again, Chen is trying to recreate the historical artifact. I don't know if these proportionally are the same kind of weight as the historical pieces were. They look lighter to me for some reason, but I can't tell by the photos. That said, they are trying to recreate as accurately as a person can reasonably the historical artifact. And from what I see in the photos, it looks like they're quite close. Okay, now I'll talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part right here. And it's an interesting shape of blade. It's small, narrow, straight. It doesn't have any recurve. It doesn't have any fullers or grinding like some of the other swords did. And it has more heft than some of the other Chen blades that I've had in hand. So the Royal Arsenal Dao was very maneuverable and light. This has a more robust and more substantial feeling. It's a heavier blade despite being small. I mean, it's not particularly long, but it doesn't have any fullering or anything like that. And it's a pretty chunky boy. So as it is, it's got some heft to it. I did polish it up and get some video of it before I broke it. You can see that it has some very nice patterning in the steel. It's nice to look at. I find it to be pleasant, not overly bold, but easy to see in, at any kind of glance. And I also polished it up with a little bit of Mother's Mag. I did diminish the polish a little bit, but not substantially. So if you had to clean it or something like that, you wouldn't lose the effect immediately. It is a pretty steep transfer to this, it's like a 45-degree angle or something, a very large angle to form the edge bevel. And it's one bevel, and it goes all the way down. It wasn't particularly sharp when I got it, though. And no particular curve. It's supposed to be pretty straight, and it has minimal taper, but those dimensions and all of that will be included down below in the description. I did sharpen the sword up, but I did some cutting prior to sharpening it, though I suppose before I talk about cutting, I'll talk about just moving it around. The act of drawing is kind of weird. That's one thing that's worth noting. Once you get the sword out, I feel like it has some options, and it's fun because you can bounce around between having a more tip heavy if you grab down by the handle or by the pommel versus something a little bit more nimble. When you draw it, I did find that brass bit to be kind of hefty and clunky and a little uncomfortable in my hand, but at the same time, I like the versatility of it, and I like how it looked, and it was different and cool. The blade moves around. It's nice. I didn't really have too many problems in moving it around, but I don't really know how I'm supposed to be moving it around. As it is, it's a fun little sword to move. It's easy enough, or can pack a little bit of heft. It's not itty bitty though. It's not the same as the Royal Arsenal. I don't feel like it's just an instant connection to my hand. It does take some dexterity to move around, but I did find it to be very manageable. I did some cutting again without sharpening the factory edge, and I didn't notice that it improved a whole lot when I went to to cut after sharpening it. But I did sharpen it, try to put a keener edge on it. I won't call it hair popping sharp, but I did sharpen it, and it made it better. I found some interesting bits when I was cutting pool noodles. I didn't notice a huge difference before or after sharpening, so it may be due to my sharpening. This edge angle is pretty robust, and so I got it what I felt was keener, but maybe, well, I guess proof is in the pudding. It wasn't sharp enough. So I didn't notice a lot there, but when I went to water bottles, it certainly made it through, but I found that I always had this odd step in my water bottle cut. So I cut a few of them, and it was fine. And again, I noticed getting my hands wet and stuff that it wasn't problematic, and I didn't have a problem gripping the sword or losing it, though I would always be a little nervous about thrusting, given that there's nothing to stop your hand from moving up. But in cutting, I always had this kind of weird step, which is maybe my angle. I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but there you go. Before I move to the next stuff, that's really all of the base level cutting that I did. And so at this point, I'm moving into abusive territory, and I want to make that very clear because some people have said cutting wood is not abusive to a sword, but I'm hitting wood in a way that I am intending to abuse this sword. I'm not trying to cut through it. I'm intentionally trying to break the sword. So bear that in mind as as I move forward here. I've cut some pizza boxes and some pool noodles and some other bits up until this point, but at this point I'm moving forward. It's also worth noting that Akitaka Channel has done some reviewing of cutting tatami, and he is able to cut just about anything with anything. So I imagine I can hand this man a spork and he would be able to execute pretty secure, good cuts. But it is proof in saying that in competent hands with a good sharpening on it, that this sword can cut tatami mats like you would expect a sword to. I, however, didn't do that. I moved on to wood and I bashed it and I chopped an old branch apart, which was much thicker than the sword. And really, it held up really well to that branch smacking. And I think that's an important bit to note. I'm smacking wood. I cut brush and stuff like that with it as well. I brought it to the backyard and knocked down some weeds and things like that. The edge held up well. It didn't rust very quickly. And it really sustained itself through some very abusive stuff. Now, again, I'm whacking it into a log and I'm cutting the thing apart. It's not a huge testament, but nothing came loose. Everything was good and solid, and the little ring bit at the end of the grip was somewhat loose beforehand, but it did move around about 2 millimeters up and down by the time I was done with the abusive stuff. So maybe some development of a rattle, so to speak, but nothing in the sword. It was straight. It was still just as sharp. It maintained the edge that I had put on it, so it held an edge pretty well. It didn't bend, it didn't deform, and I was pretty happy about that. Now, after cutting wood, I was running out of time, so I moved to just basically chucking the sword. I figured maybe it'll fall off on horseback, and I was just lobbing the thing at my stand or at a tree, and that's where the pommel dented, and it took several tosses before the pommel bent. Once it bent, though, in an attempt to straighten it, it pretty much cracked and came loose. And the pattern on here suggests that this is still quite coarse, but it did hold up to being dropped several times and being dented, and really this held up, I think, well. This is a soft metal, and there's not a whole lot of metal holding it on. It's not welded or anything, so I was confident enough in that this held up about as well as I would expect a dainty piece of jewelry to hold on. And it didn't impede the usage of the sword, other than it made it harder to draw. But I imagine if I held on that brass piece, or there was something stopping the tang from going further in the scabbard, that I'd still be able to use it and hold it and do all that stuff effectively, though I would be restricted to kind of the middle grip. Obviously, I couldn't use the pommel to maintain the sword. It's also worth knowing that I held this and hit things with it pretty hard, so with the pommel in my hand, and it held up to that kind of shock and all of that stuff as well. It wasn't until I tossed it and it hit several times pommel first that I really had any problems with it breaking. Now, after the wood cutting and all of that, it's worth pointing out that I was happy with how the sword held up. Again, no bends, no real deformation on the edge to speak of. Everything was pretty good, and it seemed to be a pretty well-made sword. So I took it to the croquet stake of doom, the sword breaker, if you will, and several strikes on the front of the sword. You know, it obviously didn't even dent or damage the sword all that much. But
decent deflection here.
Once I turned it around, it was really only a strike or two. I'm pretty sure it was like the first strike, and it just snapped and went, and the tip went away, and I actually had to play a game of Where's Waldo to find the tip. So in looking at the grain structure, it doesn't look particularly coarse or bad. It looks like a well-tempered piece. It held up really well to all of the things that I was doing, but it only took one strike on the spine. So lots of strikes on the front. I didn't see any significant cracking or edge deformation. It was relatively small, but this is a recipe, again, to break a sword. I'm not surprised. Turning it around, I stopped and made a very well, basically I stopped and did a little bit of theatrics to note specifically that I'm turning the sword around and striking the spine because I'm expecting it to break. So I made a point of that almost theatrically in the video, because I wanted everyone to know that I'm not just willy-nilly doing it. This is a recipe to break it. I would have liked it to withstand more strikes along the spine, given that I didn't see the edge deform significantly. And I'm confident that if I just kept striking the edge, it probably would have gone on for a very long time. Again, deforming the edge, smashing one side of it, turning it around and smacking it on the back is a recipe, and how I broke in many swords in many of these types of videos. But it is a testament to a sword that's well made if it can take it on both sides for a number of strikes, so to speak. This one did not. So, while I don't think it's a badly made sword, and it's obviously much smaller than some of the other swords that I test, it would have been nice if it lasted a little longer. Worth its credit in knowing, again, though, I struck it on the face of it. I cut a log in half with it. I struck it on the sides. I did a lot of that stuff before hitting it against a solid metal stake. It took that metal stake to really do much of anything, but once it failed catastrophically. So at this point, it's still pretty much a weapon. I mean, I could still use this to slash at things, but obviously it's much smaller, and it's got some good and bad. I would have liked it to hold up a little longer, but I am impressed with what I was able to do with it and how well and how long it maintains itself. So I do think it's a well-made sword, and so hopefully all that gives you some context into what kind of stuff it can take. Now, I think that brings me into the point, do I personally think the sword is worth it? Thinking of it at $350, sure, it could be better, and I bet LK Chen has done some of the stuff to address this. I know there's options sometimes to get the sword made in different steels. Maybe you could pick one that's through hardened or different or not folded and maybe gonna stand up to some of the stupidness a little bit better if that's your thing. But yes, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it because it's cool. It held up well. It's a historically made object as well. It is supposed to be very close to the original in terms of spirit and weight and dimensions and all of that kind of stuff. And so for what you're getting for the price, I think it's really cool. And it's a interesting tie to history as well as just a well-made sword. Beyond that, though, if none of that is particularly interesting to you, the video I did before this was about a Zatoichi stick and a sword cane, and so that is on my mind. And looking at this, doing this immediately after, kind of gave me some notions around customization. If I were to just cut these off with a Dremel and file them and make them somewhat pleasant, and then remove or continue to use this pommel, I think you could make a really handsome sword cane out of this. It's small and light, and it really has the shape of well, maybe not quite the shape, but a similar shape to a Zatoichi style sword caney blade. It's small. It has a, it's different. It's not katana shaped. The shinogi or the bevel would start higher on the Zatoichi style blade, but it's closer, honestly, in proportion than a lot of the reproductions are right now. And you could use this to make a pretty cool looking sword cane, I think, if you had any customization capabilities in your tool set. And the sword is pretty good. It's straight, and it would, I think, take well to doing that kind of stuff. So that kind of got my wheels spinning a little bit about the potential to use this for something else and why it might be nice, because I know there's a lot of people, based on my previous video, looking for Zatoichi stuff that's a little bit more proportional. A lot of times those things are made to be very large, thick, katana-shaped pieces, and that's not what was always used in the shows. Alternatively, there's people looking for more robust sword canes than what are out there, and this, I think, is a good candidate for a well-made sword. Obviously, if you're using a sword cane, you're not bashing it against metal poles, but this one could cut a tree branch in half, an old dried-out tree branch. So anyway, it's a well-made thing, and I think it offers some options for customization if that's your thing, because I don't see a lot of blades in this profile that are made as well as this, at least as long as you're not going and smacking it against metal stakes. Anyway, to me, yes, I think it's really good. Hopefully what I've said up until this point has proven that, but that's all I've got. Hopefully the video has been interesting. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.